This is John W. Whitehead, author of Battlefield America, The War on the American People, bringing you a message about the state of our nation. It's so easy to be distracted right now by the circus politics that dominate the news headlines. But I'm telling you, stop being distracted. Don't be fooled, not even a little, no matter how tempting it seems just to take a peek. Why? We're being subjected to the oldest con game in the books, the magician's sleight of hand that keeps you, the American people, focused on the shell game in front of you, while your wallet is being picked clean by ruffians in your midst. This is how tyranny rises and freedom falls. What characterizes American government today is not so much dysfunctional politics as it is ruthlessly contrived governance carried out behind the entertaining, distracting, and disingenuous curtain of political theater that is the government today. And what political theater it is, diabolically, Shakespearean at times, full of sound and fury, yet in the end signifying nothing. Let me be clear here. We're being ruled by a government of scoundrels, spies, thugs, thieves, gangsters, ruffians, rapists, extortionists, bounty hunters, battle-ready warriors, and cold-blooded killers who communicate using a language of force and oppression. Unfortunately, our nation of sheep has given rise to a government of wolves, howling wolves. Indeed, the U.S. government now possesses the greatest threat to our freedoms. More than terrorism, more than domestic extremism, more than gun violence and organized crime, even more than the perceived threat posed by any single politician, the U.S. government remains a greater menace to the life, liberty, and property of its citizens than any of the so-called dangers from which the government claims to protect us. Sadly, nothing has changed for the better since Donald Trump ascended to the Oval Office. As American satirist H.L. Mencken predicted almost a century ago, and I'm quoting here, all the odds are on the man who is intrinsically the most devious and mediocre, the man who can most adeptly disperse the notion that his mind is a virtual vacuum. The presidency tends, year by year, to go to such men. As democracy is perfected, the office of the president represents more and more closely the inner soul of the people. On some great and glorious day, the plain folks of the land will reach their heart's desire at last, and the White House will be adorned by a downright moron, unquote. In other words, nothing has changed, folks. The facts speak for themselves. We're being robbed blind by a government of thieves. Americans no longer have any real protection against government agents empowered to seize private property at will whenever they want to. For example, police agencies under the guise of asset forfeiture laws are taking Americans' personal property simply based on little more than a suspicion of criminal activity and keeping it for their own profit and gain, a lot of gain. In one case, police seized $53,000 from the manager of a Christian rock band that was touring and raising money for an orphanage. Homeowners are losing their homes over non-payment of taxes for as little as $400 owed to the government, and municipal bills such as water or sewer fees that amount to a fraction of what they have invested in their homes. And then there's the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, which has been searching train and airline passengers and actually pocketing their cash without ever charging them with a crime. Folks were being taken advantage of by a government of scoundrels, idiots, and cowards. As H.L. Mencken calculated, and again I'm quoting, Congress consists of 1/3 more or less scoundrels, 2/3 more or less idiots, and 3/3 more or less poltroons. And by and large, Americans seem to agree today. When you've got government representatives in Congress who actually spend a large chunk of their work hours fundraising, being feted by lobbyists, many lobbyists, shuffling through a lucrative revolving door between public service and lobbying, and making themselves available to anyone with enough money to secure access to a congressional office. You're in the clutches of a corrupt oligarchy. Mind you, these same elected officials rarely read the legislation they're enacting, nor do they seem capable of enacting much legislation that actually helps the plight of the average American citizen. More often than not, the legislation lands on the citizen in the worst straits. We're being locked up by a government of greedy jailers. We have become a carceral state, spending 3 times more on our prisons than our schools and imprisoning close to a quarter of the world's prisoners. This despite the fact that crime is at an all-time low in this country and the U.S. makes up only 5% of the world's population. The rise of overcriminalization and profit-driven private prisons provides even greater incentives for locking up American citizens for such non-violent crimes as having an overgrown lawn. As the Boston Review points out, and again I'm quoting, America's contemporary system of policing, courts, imprisonment, and parole makes money through asset forfeiture, lucrative public contracts from private service providers, and by directly extracting revenue and unpaid labor from populations of color and the poor. In states and municipalities throughout the country, the criminal justice system defrays costs by forcing prisoners and their families to pay for punishment. It also allows private service providers to charge outrageous fees for everyday needs such as telephone calls. As a result, people facing even minor criminal charges can easily find themselves trapped in a self-perpetuating cycle of debt, criminalization, and incarceration. Moreover, we're being spied on by a government of peeping Toms. The government is watching everything you do, reading everything you write, listening to everything you say, and monitoring everything you spend. Omnipresent surveillance is paving the way for government programs that profile citizens, document their behavior, and attempt to predict what they might do in the future, whether it's what they might buy, what politician they might support, or what kinds of crimes they might commit. Clearly, the impact of this far-reaching surveillance, according to Psychology Today, is, and I'm quoting, reduced trust, increased conformity, and even diminished civic participation. Clearly, as technology analyst Julian C. York concludes, mass surveillance without due process, whether undertaken by the government of Bahrain, Russia, the U.S., or anywhere in between, threatens to stifle and smother that dissent, leaving in its wake a population cowed by fear. And many people in this country are cowed by fear. Indeed, we're being ravaged by a government of ruffians, rapists, and killers. Isn't it clear? It's not just the police shootings of unarmed citizens that are worrisome. It's those SWAT team raids gone wrong, more than 80,000 annually occurring in this country, that are leaving innocent citizens wounded, children terrorized, and family pets killed. It's the roadside strip searches, in some cases cavity searches of men and women alike, carried out in full view of the public in pursuit of drugs that are never found. It's the potentially lethal and unwarranted use of so-called non-lethal weapons such as tasers on children, from mouthing off to a police officer, for trying to run from the principal's office, for at the age of 12 getting into a fight with another girl. We're being forced to surrender our freedoms, ladies and gentlemen, and those of our children, to a government of extortionists, money launderers, and professional pirates. The American people have repeatedly been sold a bill of goods about how the government needs more and more money, more expansive powers, and more secrecy. Secret courts, secret budgets, secret military campaigns, secret surveillance. All this in order to keep us safe. Under the guise of fighting its wars on terror, drugs, and now domestic extremism, the government has spent billions in taxpayer dollars on endless wars that have not ended terrorism, but merely sown the seeds of blowback from foreign governments, surveillance programs that have caught few terrorists while subjecting all Americans to a surveillance society, and militarized police that have done little to decrease crime while turning communities into war zones. Not surprisingly, the primary ones that benefit from these government exercises in legal money laundering have been the corporations, the lobbyists, and the politicians who inflict them on a trusting, but let's say too trusting public. We are being held at gunpoint by a government of soldiers, a standing army. And if it weren't enough that the American military empire stretches across the entire globe and continues to leach much needed resources from the American economy, the U.S. government is creating its own standing army of militarized police and teams of weaponized bureaucrats. Believe it or not, these civilian government employees are being armed to the hilt with guns, ammunition, and military-style equipment, authorized, by the way, to make arrests and trained in military tactics to be used against the American people. Among the agencies being supplied with night vision equipment, body armor, hollow point bullets, shotguns, drones, assault rifles, and gas cannons are the Smithsonian, the U.S. Mint, believe it or not, Health and Human Services, the IRS, the Food and Drug Administration, Small Business Administration, Social Security Administration, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Education Department, the Energy Department, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, and an assortment of public universities. Believe it or not, there are now reportedly more bureaucratic, non-military government civilians armed with high-tech, deadly weapons than the U.S. Marines. That doesn't even begin to touch on the government's arsenal, the transformation of local police into extensions of the military, and the speed with which the nation would be locked down under martial law, depending on the circumstances. To our detriment, the criminal class that Mark Twain referred to as Congress has since expanded to include every government agency that feeds off the carcass of our once constitutional republic. The government and its cohorts have conspired to ensure that the only real recourse the American people have to hold the government accountable or express their displeasure with the government is through voting, which, by the way, is no real recourse at all at this time. For too long, we the people have obeyed the government's dictates, no matter how unjust. We have paid its taxes, penalties, and fines, no matter how outrageous. We have tolerated its indignities, insults, and abuses, no matter how egregious. And we have turned a blind eye to its indiscretions and incompetence, no matter how imprudent. We have held our silence in the face of its lawlessness, licentiousness, and corruption, no matter how illicit. Oh, how we have suffered, folks. How long will we continue to suffer depends on how much we're willing to give up for the sake of freedom. It may well be that Professor Morris Berman is correct. Perhaps we're entering into the dark ages that signify the final phase of the American empire. It seems to me that the people do get the government they deserve, and even beyond that, the government who they are, so to speak. In that regard, we might consider, as an extreme version of this, Berman says, that Hitler was as much an expression of the German people at that point in time as he was a departure from them. Folks, for the moment, the American people seem so content to sit back and watch the reality TV programming that passes for politics today. It's the modern-day equivalent of bread and circuses, a carefully calibrated exercise in how to manipulate, polarize, propagandize, and control a population, a docile population. And what happens when the people become distracted, easily led sheep? Slavery. The loss of freedom, the rise of tyranny. Yes, that sounds about right. We, the people, have learned only too well how to be slaves. Worse, we have come to enjoy our voluntary servitude, which masquerades as citizenship. Unfortunately, we won't be able to sustain this fiction much longer. Things fall apart, wrote W.B. Yeats, the poet, in his dark, forbidding poem, The Second Coming. He wrote, "The sinner cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. Surely some revelation is at hand." Yes, folks, a revelation is at hand. We better wake up and break free of our chains. Something wicked this way does come. The Rutherford Institute is doing its part to push back against the police state and make the government play by the rules of the Constitution. But we can't fight these battles alone. To join the resistance and help us spread the word, start by liking this video and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Visit our website at www.rutherford.org and check out our library of thought-provoking commentaries, legal resources, and so much more. Subscribe to our email alerts and I will send you my weekly commentary, Rutherford Press alerts, and a weekly rundown of pertinent headlines and news articles to keep you apprised of the growing threats to our freedoms. And finally, if you are able, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to the Rutherford Institute by again visiting us online at www.rutherford.org or donate using PayPal. Your donation allows the Rutherford Institute to push back against the government's power grabs, corruption, and ongoing assaults on the Constitution. Together, we can make America free again.